Business ethics, the study of what constitutes right or wrong, good or bad, human conduct in a business context. What truly is the right way to manage a business? What is too far in the race to making a profit? From early Greek philosophers to modern ethicists, they all search for the same answers to the same question.
Students, welcome into this first lecture for BUL3130. For this lecture, we're going to spend some time going over case study 2.1, the very first case study you have. We're going to go over case 2.1, go through a little bit of a summary of it, talk about some of the questions that are asked in it, and then we're going to discuss a couple of different ethical theories that could be posed toward it to see which one of those may fit, what the outcomes might be on those. We'll discuss it from the viewpoint of we'll discuss it from a Kantian outlook, and then we'll discuss it from a utilitarian ethical outlook on the case. We'll do that and spend a little bit of time talking about some of the ethical theories that you see in chapter 2. Not really spend a lot of time in chapter 1 as it's just an introduction to ethics. Pretty much as you read through it, it'll give you the information that you need for it. We'll talk a little bit about chapter 2 and what it covers as we go through this. All right, so one of the first things we want to think about as we're going through and looking at this is just the basics of what happened here. So we had students who are in the MBA program, around 200 of those, who somehow through a URL that was sent to them, they were allowed to get a beforehand look at their scores and what was going on with their attempts to get into Harvard, MIT, Stanford, colleges like Duke, Dartmouth, places like that. As they did this, they were violating a rule in place, and they were going beyond what was allowable. All right, so we'll leave it at that with just that summary to think about it. And let's consider what happened here. So with the schools, Harvard, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, they across the board just blanketly rejected all the applicants who accessed that information, citing that it was an ethical violation for their institutions, which is their call. That's what they did, how they saw it, what their boards came up with. Stanford gave the applicants a chance to explain themselves, but still did the same thing. They ended up rejecting everyone who had done this, who had accessed that in that way. And then you had Duke and Dartmouth, who kind of handled their cases individually, but they did not publicize any of the outcomes of those investigations into those cases. So when we think about what those outcomes would be, and we look at what the ethics behind it could be, we can think of what the supporters, the critics might have said about it. Supporters for it said that the schools upheld some integrity and leadership standards that are expected, especially among MBA programs. And then as you get into your highly recognized business schools like your Harvard and MITs and Stanford and Duke, places like that, those programs carry with them a certain prestige for having an MBA from those programs. And so they want to make sure that the students who come out of it, they come out of it and they carry that prestige with them and live up to a standard that they expect. The critics, on the other hand, claim that the punishment was extremely harsh. A lot of it, saying that the word hacking and them hacking into the program might have been misleading. That the vulnerability behind the software that was being used was to blame. They did not hack in for to get answers to a test. They didn't they didn't get in there to manipulate grades or do things on those lines. They just got a little bit of insight into what was going on with applications and things on those lines. Some of the applicants, they said it was just curiosity, not malice, so they did. And some of them said that other family members had accessed the data instead of them, but it's without, being an individual in the process, we would not know exactly what the mindset of those individuals would be. And so we look at it from a little bit broader outlook, and we think of the questions that were raised. What are the ethics when you can access something digital? Where does personal responsibility come in this? When you think about personal responsibility, is were there differences in generational views? Were the board members looking at this of a generation that saw this as completely different than the generation of the applicants that were putting in for this? The way things are done in a digital world could be different than what was thought of previously. And in a time before digital, this would, for them to get this early access, it would involve someone actually stealing a file and looking at it, to where in this case it was manipulating a weakness in software that allowed them to look at this. And so the way it was viewed may have some bearing on generational views. And then there's always those, the boundaries that get crossed and what it means when those boundaries are crossed. That it crossed a moral boundary. Was it some type of issue that should have been, handled differently in what they did? So now that we've kind of looked at it from that standpoint and we have an idea of what went on, some of the background behind it. Now, when you get into the case study, please read the entire case. Do not base it solely upon my summary when you respond. You'll want to read through it so that you can decide what parts are relevant to the point the stand that you take with this and the point you're trying to make with your responses. So make sure you read through the whole thing. Please do not go based upon my summary. This is something that I've worked up that just summarizes it in the way I saw it. I want to make sure that you understand that it may not be fully inclusive of everything that is in the case or in the article about the case. This was pieced together from several different cases that put together this, overall. But now let's look at it from a standpoint of what Kantian, Immanuel Kant, the Kantian, those principles and what it would have been as he was looking at those. The basis behind Immanuel Kant's ethical theory is that rightness or wrongness of the action themselves and not their consequences so much. So let's think about it from the categorical imperative, is that you act only according to that maxim which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, if you do something, make sure it's something that you could will this to be applicable to everyone and fit everyone in the same way. You respect persons in this ethical mindset. It's, treating humanity, whether it's, your own person or others, always as an end and never as a means. So someone, what is the furtherance, not the right now, basically. And they carry his duty and moral law requirements. You don't do those out of inclination or in self-interest. They're done from a standpoint of a duty. So when we take that into mind and what that means, how would we apply it to that case? So if we look at the maxim that it's acceptable to access restricted information if I'm curious and capable. So some of the students and some of the applicants, in this case, applicant said, well, I was just curious about what it was. I didn't mean any harm in it. So if we base it on that maxim, Kant will look at it and say, well, if everyone followed this maxim, trust in digital systems would collapse. And if that is the case, if we're thinking, okay, those digital systems would collapse, then the action will fail the universality test, because then we're causing a collapse in a system that is relied upon by more than just that one person. And if you say, well, it's okay for everybody to look if they're they're concerned or they're curious or whatever, then according to Kant, you're looking at it and saying, okay, well, this is not something that can be universally applied, because it would have a a downfall, it would cause a consequence that uh, would not so much be, you know, in there, but it would be the rightness and wrongness of the action itself. What is that going to do? Is it going to, how is it going to change everything? And so it would be viewed as wrong, and it would have to be either right or wrong for everyone. And you can't make that type of action apply in that way. So when they look at how they did this, then what does it mean as far as treating others as an end? Well, they use the admission system and the trust in institutions to satisfy their own personal curiosity and gain an early advantage. Had they reported that, hey, there's a way that you can see this, that someone done that prior to the individuals assessing this or accessing this, then there could have been, you would have a closer ability under the empirical or categorical imperative to line that up. That would violate under Kant's view the principle of treating others as an end and not a means. The school and the staff, they were treated more as a means to an end. Use the system, use them, and use the weakness that we found to get the information we want. So they were using it as a means to an end instead of looking at, those officials, the staff who built that programming or whatever as an end in themselves. Then we have to look at the part where under Kant we have duty to others. What was the duty here? Did they breach a duty to others when they were doing this? So we must act with some type of moral duty under Kantian ethics, and not from impulsive action, not under self-interest, not because we're just looking, we have an emotional stake in what we're doing, but we have to think, can I do this? And then once I do this, or before I do this, can I apply it to everyone universally? And if I cannot do that, then, I need to rethink. And then am I using this as a means to get to an end, or am I treating these people as an end? In other words, my whole goal is to get everyone to the same point that I'm at. Well, if they apply those, then we see there were some interests, there were some self-interest issues there. The actors themselves involved in this claimed that it was out of curiosity, not malice, but curiosity. So curiosity is a self-interest. We look into stuff if we're curious about it for our own self-interest. So in and of itself, it goes against what Kant would expect as far as us acting out of a duty to not harm and not do anything. Even if the intention of harming was not there, the actions were not grounded in that duty and respect for what the institutions expected of their incoming students in an MBA program. And so by violating that expectation, they then, could not level it up to face the scrutiny of what would be expected under a look at Kantian ethics. Now let's take, for instance, the school's response. Now the school itself, and Harvard and others, they emphasize that moral character, integrity, responsibility, those values, they deeply align with Kantian ethics. And they say by rejecting applicants who failed to act ethically, they upheld the idea that future leaders must be guided by duty and moral law, not expedience. And so they were saying that we do this now so that it is applied to others to a certain extent, and they will act in a way that is appropriate and what is expected of someone in this program, or someone who is seeking admission into the MBA program at Harvard, at MIT, at Duke, at Stanford, those places where, that prestige comes with being a graduate of those programs. And so they said that what they did and what they finally did was just based upon making sure that duty applied to all. Now, if we tie this together and look at it from the perspective of Kantian ethics, we could say that the applicants did indeed act immorally according to Kantian ethics, that what they did cannot be universalized to everyone because of what could happen to eroding the systems that are there to make sure that everyone has a fair shot. They did not respect the institutions as the moral agents that they should have, and their actions were not motivated by duty, but by personal gain and curiosity. So, in that aspect, Kantian ethics would condemn the act because it's not about the consequence of the act, but the failure to follow the duty that was expected of the applicants in this instance. So that's from looking at it from Immanuel Kant, your Kantian way of looking at it. Now let's think about it from what a utilitarian ethical basis would look at. Utilitarian is a little different. It is consequentialist, so it does look at the consequences and judges the action by their outcomes. So, greatest happiness principle is one of those. An action is morally right if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number. Utility in it is measured in terms of happiness, well-being, and preference, satisfaction, and impartiality. Everyone's happiness counts equal. So we have, when we view this under this microscope, we do so that looking at the consequences. Did it bring happiness to the greatest number? And did it produce the greatest good for the greatest number in this instance? Can we measure what happened in happiness, well-being, or preference, satisfaction for the group as a whole? And can we say that everyone was equally happy with the outcome? You know, we can, before we even go into reasoning, we could say, okay, well, we could probably take impartiality off of it because there were definitely not some folks who were happy in this. The schools themselves, the admissions officers, and probably some of the outside onlookers when they found out about it. So we could say that it doesn't line up with impartiality. Did it bring greater hope for the greatest number? Well, that depends. You had about 200 applicants who were caught doing this, and there are several thousand applicants per term applying to MBA programs, thousands, tens of thousands trying to get into MBA programs, and specifically ones at a place like a Harvard or an MIT or Duke, where their MBA programs line up with names that you hear when you look at financial institutions and the people who run some of the major banks and who handle some of the finances for nations. And so did it, give the greatest happiness to the greatest number? Well, you probably had a whole lot of alumna who were looking at this thinking, well, that doesn't bring us any, happiness. So, what is what are we looking at here? So once again, it doesn't quite line up. Now let's look at it from just the individual, same way we did the last one. Let's not make a decision right off the top. Let's spend a little bit of time looking into it just like we did with the last one. Now, when we look at this from the standpoint of the applicants, right, their potential benefit, potential harms, we'll break it down that way. They satisfied the curiosity, they reduced anxiety, and they gained early insight into the future. So for the applicants, their benefits were great for them. The harms that this could have caused, though, is that breach of trust, undermining fairness, and then damaging institutional integrity. And that damaging of the institutional integrity is where you see a greater harm to a greater number than what would have been had they just waited to find out. So the utilitarian, when they're looking at this to decide on the ethics of it, did the overall happiness created by assessing the information outweigh the harm caused? So would that be something that is done, and how would that fit into it? The institutional response, Harvard and MIT's rejections, their decisions may have caused distress to the applicants, but they also reinforce ethical standards protecting their institutional reputation, sending a message to future applicants. So, do not do this kind of stuff. And so, was it a small harm to a small group? Because, out of the 200, we don't know exactly how many might have been Harvard or MIT just based on the summary. When we look through it, we can find out more. But even then, you have this across the board at several different schools. And so you can imagine that they're spread out. And so the number decreases with each school out of the 200. And so we have a small number harmed by the decision of the institutions. And then we weigh that against the number who maybe have been given, the point, they got the point that do not do this. And so it is, did we do a greater good for a greater number than the number we harmed with the punishment? And that is one way you look at it from the utilitarian standpoint. With Stanford using a case by case, this one could be a little bit more intricate in how you had to look at it, because you're maximizing utility by balancing fairness with accountability. Did each person personally access it, or did someone access it on their behalf? And so there was some like, okay, did someone else access this and you not personally do this? Where would the judgment call be at in that instance? When we think about how a utilitarian would probably look at it after they looked at the responses of the schools and what the applicants did, then they would think that the actions caused more harm than good. If they did that, then they would say that they're morally wrong. If the school's responses deter future unethical behavior and promote that culture of integrity that is expected, they could be justified even if they were considered harsh by some, because they serve the greater good. And of course, the critics are going to say that it was all part of the, disproportionate to the harm as far as the punishment goes, or the software flaw was actually to blame. Blame it on the tech and not on the people, right? The more rehabilitative approach, like Stanford's, could have produced a better overall outcome. And you can look at it from a lot of different ways of thinking and have decided, maybe one school's response is better than the others. But from the two ethical ways of looking at this that we just took, whether it's through the Kantian or through utilitarian, both of those ultimately would likely say that the actions of the students were wrong, or the applicants were wrong in getting early access to the information that they did. And so they would look at it and say, based upon how we think a person should act, based upon our ethical way of looking at things, yes, we have some issues here that in lines that were crossed. And so there needs to be some, there needs to be some punishment, as long as the punishment doesn't end up outweighing what had happened as far as utilitarian goes. So just a quick, way to tie it up. Under the Kantian ethics, the focus that they were looking at was the duty, the intention, and the moral law of it. They would say that the applicant's actions were wrong, regardless of what the outcome was. Utilitarian, the consequences overall good. They would say it depends on net happiness of the applicants versus the harm. But when we review how it was, the harm was likely greater than what that was. All right, so hopefully that helps you with the case study. It'll help you get a little bit of insight into it. Now, there's a lot more to look at other than just utilitarianism and Kantian. There's more ethical theories that are within the first couple of chapters that it talks about. So make sure, based upon reading through the chapters, that you're answering it in a way that you think it should be. I'm not looking for you to just give back to me what I just said. And so please do not do that, but spend time going through it, looking it over, and coming up with a good response. I'll be interested to see your responses on this one. I thought this was a real good one to start off. It gives you a chance to spend some time thinking about, an issue that, did not necessarily have an overall damaging consequence in any way, but it did allow for you to look at what happens when someone does something that is not expected to be done. And when that expectation is for them to be honorable, and maybe this doesn't fit into that, or to be truthful and it doesn't fit into this, what responses could be, and how a couple of the different ethical theories that we'll study throughout the course fit into that. All right, so thank you for that listening. Hopefully this helped you some. I do hope that throughout this course you do get a better understanding of the ethics side of doing business. It's really easy to teach the law side. Law side is super easy because it's there. You know, this is the law. This is what it says. This is how you start a business. That's easy. This is what it means for employment law. That's really easy. But the ethical side is where you have to look at it from a standpoint of what you're doing and what your decisions are, and decisions of your business or a corporation that you may work for. What are they doing morally that may have far-reaching effects outside of the business and what you're doing? So hopefully as we go through this, you'll get some good insight on that and what it means to not only be a law-abiding business person, but an ethically a business person that does things in an ethical way for the good of those who they serve. So until the next time, stay safe and study hard.